Hello everyone. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about the cranial nerves and sensory receptors. We're going to begin with the sensory receptors. During our discussion of the nervous system, we've been talking about the afferent side, carrying information from both the surface of the body and the internal parts of the body along neural pathways towards the central nervous system. We said that information is received by receptors, specifically sensory receptors. These are structures that are found in membrane and other types of tissue that are specialized in detecting some kind of a stimulus. Many of them are specialized epithelial cells that synapse with the dendrites of a neuron. Other sensory receptors are modified neurons themselves. Sensory receptors are capable of transmitting 4 different types of information. We refer to these as modality, location or distribution, intensity, and duration. The important thing to remember is that a sensory receptor is performing that important physiological function called signal transduction. Depending on the sensory receptor, it is receiving some kind of information. It is transforming it into an electrical signal that it then sends along afferent pathways towards the central nervous system, so that whatever that sensation is can be perceived, integrated, and responded to. So when we use this word modality to classify a sensory receptor, we're really talking about the type of stimulus that it's capable of receiving. For example, there are what we refer to as thermoreceptors, and these are receptors that are capable of receiving information about temperature, whether it's environmental temperature or temperature in the internal parts of the body. These are receptors that are able to respond to and receive information about temperatures that are either warmer than normal or colder than normal or in the normal range. Photoreceptors are the kinds of receptors that are able to receive information about light. You have photoreceptors in the retina of your eyes. Nociceptor is a type of receptor that responds to painful stimuli. Chemoreceptors are capable of responding to different types of chemical exposures. And finally, there's a large group of sensory receptors that are just sort of blanketly called mechanoreceptors. And these are receptors that receive information about some kind of a mechanical stimulus. Some of them are sensitive to touch. Some of them are sensitive to pressure, some to stretch or vibration. Any kind of a mechanical stimulation is received by a mechanoreceptor. It's important to remember that while there's only 5 types of sensory receptors listed here in terms of modality, within each one of these, there are different subtypes. So, for example, there isn't one single nociceptor. There are several different subtypes of nociceptors that respond to and receive information about different types of pain. Another thing that's important to remember is that some of these receptors are capable of cross-reacting with other kinds of stimuli. A good example of this is the application of isopropyl alcohol to the surface of your skin. Think about the last time you did that. Think about the last time maybe you used an alcohol wipe on your hands or somewhere else on your skin. The wipe undoubtedly felt very cold on your skin. And that's because alcohol, while it stimulates chemoreceptors, is also capable of stimulating thermoreceptors. And the thermoreceptors, because they're cross-reacting, it's not that the alcohol is always cold. It's that alcohol just happens to stimulate a thermoreceptor as though it were cold. That's what we call cross-reactivity. And there are examples of cross-reactivity across different types of sensory receptors. So modality is one way that we classify sensory receptors, but we also classify them according to where they're located. There are three types of sensory receptor by location. First is the exteroceptor, then there is an interoceptor, and then there is a proprioceptor. We've already talked a little bit about proprioception. Proprioception being this ability of the human body to know at any moment what its position is in space, even without touching things and opening the eyes and looking at where the body is. Proprioception is a special sense that human beings have, and they receive information constantly from different parts of the body to send that kind of proprioceptive information to the central nervous system. When we use the term exteroceptor, we're talking about sensory receptors that are external. So any sensory receptor that is in contact with and receiving information about the external environment, you can call that an exteroceptor. If it's an interoceptor, it's receiving information about the internal environment, what's happening with the tissues inside the body. That's location. Another way that we classify sensory receptors is by how they are distributed. And there are really two groups in this category. There are what we refer to as somesthetic receptors and the special senses receptors. So when I use that word somesthetic, those are general senses. Again, generally things like touch related, things that we've talked about before in terms of information about soft touch or deep touch or pressure or stretch or vibration. These are somesthetic. They are related to the state of the body in general. Compare that to the special senses. When we use the term special senses, we are referring to sight, to hearing, to smell, and to taste. So the ability of the eyes to receive information through photoreceptors, and the ability of the ears to receive information about sound, the nose to receive information about smell, and the tongue about taste. These are considered special senses, and the receptors that are found in those locations are highly, highly specialized to only receive that kind of information. Okay, we're going to switch gears now and leave the sensory receptors and begin a discussion of the cranial nerves. It's important to remember that when we talk about the nervous system, remember we said the first way we break it down is into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central being the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral being everything else outside of those two structures. we've talked about how the peripheral nervous system sends information along afferent pathways toward the central nervous system, where that information is integrated and then a response is generated. That response travels along efferent pathways back out into the periphery, where a response is made through effector cells. When we think about the nervous system in this way, there are pathways that travel between each part of the central nervous system and the rest of the body. So we've talked at length about the pathways that exist between the spinal cord and the body. We talked about the 31 pair of spinal nerves that emerge from the spinal cord and then branch into those 4 primary branches, which then go on to branch again and again and again, producing all of the nerves that you find in the peripheral nervous system. We've talked about how information that comes from the body into the spinal cord is then often relayed up to the brain, because the brain and the spinal cord play roles in integrating information and responding. What we haven't talked about yet are pathways that exist outside of the spinal cord that allow the body and the brain to communicate. So pathways exist outside of the spinal cord, just between the body and the brain. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, the cranial nerves. And there are 12 pair of them, emerging from the brain and going on to branch and branch and branch out into the body to both provide pathways for sensory information to come into the brain and for motor information to go back out. Now, as we're talking about the cranial nerves today, I want you to keep 3 things in mind, 3 things that you need to know about these critically important cranial nerves. We're going to learn them in terms of their name and a number that gets associated with them. We're going to learn whether or not they provide sensory information, motor information, or are mixed. And we're going to talk about what specific function they have, what specific role they play in the nervous system. On this slide, I have a list of the 12 cranial nerves. And just like we saw with the spinal nerves, these cranial nerves are paired. There's going to be one emerging from the left and one emerging from the right. So they're numbered from 1 to 12, and you'll notice that they're numbered using Roman numerals. And next to each one of these numbers, you'll see that they have a name. Now, one of the interesting things about this system, this number and name system, is that the lower the number of the cranial nerve, the more anterior it sits in the brain. So, for example, cranial nerve 1, which is the olfactory nerve, is the most anterior cranial nerve. And I'll show you a picture of this in just a minute. And then the next most anterior is cranial nerve 2, and then comes cranial nerve 3, all the way down to cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve, which sits in the most posterior position in the brain. So there is order, there is a reason for this numbering system in terms of where we find these nerves in the brain. Now, the other thing I want you to notice on this slide is that some of these nerves have names that gives us information about what they do. Or, in other words, what kind of tissue they are impacting. So, for example, cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, is involved in smell. Cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, is involved in sight. And you'll notice as you go down the list, there are several of these where the name gives us information about what the nerve does. Now, some of them are easier to translate than others. For example, oculomotor means motor input to the eyes. So the movement, for example, of the eyeball, the muscles around the eyeball that help to move it into different positions. We're going to skip over trochlear and trigeminal and abducens. The facial nerve, that should tell you that this is a nerve that's providing some kind of nervous input to the face. Vestibulocochlear. If you're not familiar with these terms, this translates as balance and hearing. Vestibulo refers to balance. Cochlear refers to hearing. Glossopharyngeal translates as tongue. That's glosso. And pharynx, the back of your throat. We'll skip over vagus and accessory, and finally we get to hypoglossal, the most posterior cranial nerve 12. Hypo means less than, or under, or beneath. So this translates as beneath or below the tongue. So a lot of these names give us information about what function the nerve has, but some of them obviously don't. There are 5 names on this list that I've skipped over that you can't automatically know what they do by the name, so we'll have to use other tricks to help us remember them. That's cranial nerve 4, which is the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. This one has 3 independent branches. Cranial nerve 6, which is the abducens nerve. Cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. And cranial nerve 11, which is the accessory nerve. So they're going to have functions that are difficult to figure out, at least according to their name. But we'll talk about each one of these nerves individually. On this slide, you're looking at a drawing of the human brain, and we are looking up at the inferior surface of the brain. So this is the area of the cerebellum, right here. You can see the bottom of the brainstem here, and then you can see the cerebrum with its gyri and sulci. So we're looking at the very bottom surface, if you will, the inferior surface of the brain, and they're showing us the location of these paired cranial nerves. Remember, we have mirror image symmetry in the brain and the spinal cord. So these nerves are paired, one on the left and one on the right. This is the olfactory nerve here. You can see optic nerve. Now they've cut the optic nerve off. They just are showing us where it originates. Here's the oculomotor, number 3. Trochlear, number 4 in pink. Trigeminal, number 5 in blue. See how it has 3 branches on each side. Then we have abducens, number 6 in purple. The facial nerve, number 7, is shown in green here and here. Vestibulocochlear, number 8, is in pink, right up next to the facial. Number 9 is glossopharyngeal. This one is in a very light color right here and here. Number 10 is the vagus. That's shown in this orangey color right here and here. Number 11 is accessory. That one is shown here. And then number 12 is hypoglossal. And you can see that one in sort of this brownish color here. So front to back, all emerging close to the midline, and each one paired, one on the left, one on the right. This is another drawing. This one has removed both the cerebellum and the cerebrum from the picture. So we're only looking at the brainstem here. You can see the thalamus up on top here. Here's the midbrain. Here's the pons in blue, the medulla oblongata in green, and then we come down into the spinal cord. This is a nice image to see some of these cranial nerves as they really lie, because they can be a little bit obstructed when you include the entirety of the brain. So again, if you start up at the top, you'll be able to follow the numbers down. Now they've removed the olfactory nerve in this picture, because if you remember, the olfactory nerve is anterior to the beginnings of the brainstem. So you can't see that one in this picture, but you can see the optic nerve, cranial nerve too, and you can really get a sense of how this has this strange tract that wraps around the midbrain. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So a lot of these cranial nerves, most of these cranial nerves, are emerging from parts of the brainstem and are very close to the midline.